Before we get into who Hamas is, let us take a look at how Hamas was formed, what their goals are, and how they get their support. They are an Islamic resistance group religiously, and a nationalistic group politically. Taking control politically in Gaza in 2006, and then militarily in 2007 after the Battle of Gaza. Wikipedia also mentions that they hold the majority in the Palestinian Authority Parliament, however that is no longer true. The battle was caused by a disagreement over who should control the security forces in Gaza, Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. This led to the war. This is also why Israel and Egypt began blockading Gaza. They reasoned that the Palestinian Authority no longer had security forces there and they could not guarantee anyone's safety. The main goal of Hamas is to destroy the state of Israel and to create an Islamic state. Many outsiders have compared them to Taliban, however some Hamas members claim their goal is to actually emulate the Turkish government style under Recep Erdogan. Most critics say that actions speak louder than words and it appears they have a Taliban-styled government going on at the moment. There are two ways that Hamas gets most of their support. The first one is that they are seen as the only Arabs actively fighting Israel. The second way is that they use conflicts and civilian deaths to gain international sympathy and support. With the goal of getting public support, Hamas has mostly failed. Numbers show that multiple countries' citizens hold a negative opinion of them. Those countries that were polled included Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia, Tunisia, Bangladesh, and Palestinian Israelis. Of those polled, only Tunisia and Indonesia had less than 50% when it comes to negative opinion. Arabic Israelis also have a 68% negative viewpoint when it comes to the numbers. Old data from the 90s also shows that Palestinians have never approved of Hamas terror tactics such as suicide bombing. Arab leaders also fear that supporting Hamas could lead to uprisings in their own countries, so they are reluctant to support Hamas. The West definitely doesn't support Hamas as a whole. The West also proves that you can support Palestinians without supporting Hamas. Some countries are not afraid to vocally support Hamas though. Some even support them financially, funding their terrorist group. The two largest funders today are Qatar and Turkey. Qatar uses their media, Al Jazeera, to tell Hamas side of the story. They also help them set up an international political bureau in Qatar. This does not come as a surprise as Qatar has a history of supporting terrorist groups which even led to an Arabic blockade of them, which ended in 2020. In 2017 the Palestinian Authority started to boycott and blockade Gaza as well. However, Israel allowed non-military aid from Qatar to go through their own blockade. The final point about Qatar is that any time a conflict breaks out, they are the first to try to start ceasefire talks. Not only is Qatar a great ally of Hamas, Turkey is also a huge financial supporter of the terrorist group. Both of these countries funded with hundreds of millions of dollars. Erdogan, of Turkey, loves the group and encourages his followers to support Hamas as well. He has invited and hosted the leader of Hamas inside Turkey, a supposed secular state. Erdogan has also called Israel the real terrorists as he tries to shift the blame of terrorism, and avoids rebuking them internationally. The Palestinian Authority often claims that Iran funds Hamas. In the past this was true. In 2007 Iran funded Hamas with a total of $105 million. Along with another ally in Syria, in 2011 Hamas received $13 million a month from both Syria and Iran. The funding of Hamas ended in the coming years, this being due to Hamas being a Sunni group. They, like most of the Sunni world, supported the Sunni rebels, who were fighting against Assad. Hamas was also critical of Iran helping Houthi rebels in Yemen. These two events led to the end of funding from Iran and Syria. There are several other Arab states to mention. The first one is Egypt. Morsi was elected and he voiced support for Hamas, however he was ousted. A famous Egyptian imam also called for support of Hamas. However, Egypt has outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood and frowns upon other hardline Islamic groups such as Hamas. Egypt also fears that destroying Hamas may lead to even more radical religious groups taking power in Gaza. Another past ally who ended up banning Hamas was Jordan, who banned it in 1999. Since that time, the Hamas leader has had trouble finding a home. Later he was kicked out of Damascus, when he supported the Sunni rebels there in 2012. Eventually settling in Qatar, where he resides now. In general, there is state and civilian vocal support for Hamas that still exists across the Middle East, but most are only words with no financial or military support. A unique non-Muslim and non-Arabic supporter is Russia. They promised aid in 2006, however it is unclear if they ever paid any aid. There was a recent Monitor article that says Putin supports Hamas as leverage over the United States. However, it appears that Putin and Russia are not interested in resolving any of Hamas or the Palestinians' problems. They are only interested in using Hamas and Palestine as a way to gain redemption in the Muslim world after killing so many Muslims in the Syrian civil war. In the West and in the international community, there is a bit of passive support for Hamas by putting focus on Israel or focus on Palestinian refugees. Sometimes it is a bit direct, like this YouTube comment. It ignores the fact that Palestinians began the killing in 1917, which led to the UK arming the Jewish settlers. Often these comments focus on recent history and ignore the past. This sentiment is able to get even more support when civilians are killed by Israel when it attacks Hamas. Much of this support in the US has come from Democrat supporters and voters. They have obviously been affected by the death tolls, which, if you remember, is part of the Hamas strategy. Within the Democratic political arena, there are also some direct and passive supporters. The first one is Ilhan Omar, who deflects blame and instead calls Israel terrorists. This is much like Erdogan, if you recall. The Squad, which is a group of 4 progressive liberal women, has also been nicknamed the Hamas Caucus. This is due to their negative statements on Israel but none about Hamas. The final Squad member who supports Hamas is Rashida Tlaib, who spouts the same one-state vision as Hamas. It is a bit more democratic sounding, but bad for the same reasons. These pro-Hamas rhetorical statements have caused some of the Squad members to lose donations. Such as Tlaib, who recently lost an endorsement from a liberal Israel group. Now there is also a list of countries that passively support Hamas by refusing to call Hamas a terrorist group. Brazil and Iran only state that they do not consider it to be a terrorist group. Jordan kicked out Hamas in 1999, but still doesn't call them a terrorist group. Norway refuses to call Hamas a terrorist group, and also attacks the European Union for daring to call them such. China not only refused to call them a terrorist organization but also called them a legitimate government and opened ties with them. Egypt has gone back and forth from calling them a terrorist group and then removing their designation. Qatar has a terrorist list with no names on it, and actively funds Hamas. Russia does not call them a terrorist organization, and opened relations with them in an attempt to get them to recognize Israel. Saudi Arabia designated the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, included the branch in Hamas but did not call Hamas itself a terrorist group. Switzerland did not call them a terrorist group due to their neutrality policies. Syria also does not call Hamas a terrorist organization, and calls them an armed struggle for freedom. Finally, Turkey, as discussed earlier, is one of the main financial funders of Hamas, therefore they do not call them terrorists. The final supporter of Hamas might be the United Nations. As they often have critical comments and resolutions about Israel and have been consistently anti-Israeli since 1967, their comments of course can embolden Hamas and other terrorist groups. In 2018, the United Nations rejected a resolution to call Hamas a terrorist group. 87 nations said Hamas were terrorists, 58 said they were not terrorists, 32 countries were conveniently absent and 16 refused to vote. The United Nations then passed a resolution only voted on by 20 countries, all of which were Arabic, to call Israel an apartheid state in early 2021. This shows us that the United Nations as a majority does consider Hamas a terrorist group. However, due to country relationships and fear of possible terrorist attack reprisals, they decline to vote or don't show up to the vote. In summary, Turkey and Qatar are the biggest supporters of Hamas. There are also many passive supporters, as well as portions of the Democrats in the United States and countries in the United Nations who directly or indirectly support Hamas. As long as Hamas does garner support, we all know that Palestine will never be a state. This is unfortunate, so we encourage everyone to oppose Hamas, if they want a free Palestinian state.